The story begins not with war, but with uncertainty. In the winter of 1620, a small English ship called the Mayflower dropped anchor off the coast of what would become New England. The passengers who staggered onto the frozen shoreline were not conquerors in any immediate sense. They were families, laborers, religious separatists seeking distance from the authority of the English crown and the hierarchy of the church. They arrived unprepared. The land they stepped onto was not empty wilderness, though it may have appeared so to them. It was part of a vast, lived-in world, mapped not by ink on parchment, but by kinship, trade routes, seasonal migrations, and memory. Forests had been shaped by controlled burns. Fields had long been cultivated with corn, beans, and squash. Rivers carried canoes as frequently as the English would later float timber. The newcomers survived their first winter only because the world they had entered chose, briefly, to tolerate them. To the south of their struggling settlement lay the homeland of the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by a sachem known to the English as Massasoit. His people had endured catastrophe before the English ever arrived. Between 1616 and 1619, epidemic disease, likely introduced by earlier European fishermen and traders, had swept through coastal communities. Entire villages were emptied, political alliances fractured, regional balance shifted. Massasoit faced rivals to the west, particularly the Narragansett, who had been less affected by disease and were growing stronger. The English settlement at Plymouth represented risk, but also opportunity. In the spring of 1621, diplomacy took form. Through interpreters like Tisquantum, known to the English as Squanto, who had himself survived kidnapping, enslavement in Europe, and eventual return, the two sides forged a mutual defense agreement. The treaty was pragmatic. Neither side fully understood the other's cosmology, law, or future intentions, but they understood survival. The Wampanoag would provide food and guidance. The English would supply metal tools and military support if necessary. For a generation, the agreement held. English fields expanded slowly at first. Wooden homes replaced makeshift shelters. Livestock multiplied. Trade in furs, corn, and manufactured goods created a fragile economic rhythm between communities that viewed land through entirely different philosophies. To the English, land was property, bounded, owned, improved through fencing and permanent settlement. To the Wampanoag and neighboring nations, land was stewardship, used seasonally, shared across kin networks, spiritually anchored rather than commodified. These differences did not immediately erupt into violence. They manifested instead as misunderstandings. A deed signed under English legal custom might represent permanent transfer to a colonist, but to a native sachem, it could signify shared use or diplomatic accommodation. As decades passed, the demographic balance began to shift. More ships arrived. The Great Migration brought thousands of Puritan settlers into Massachusetts Bay during the 1630s. Entire congregations crossed the Atlantic. Towns multiplied: Boston, Salem, Hartford. Roads cut through forest corridors that had once been hunting paths. English livestock trampled native planting grounds. Colonial courts enforced unfamiliar laws. Missionaries pressed for conversion, establishing so-called praying towns, where native inhabitants were encouraged, or coerced, to adopt English customs, religion, and agricultural patterns. Conversion did not merely alter worship, it altered allegiance. Communities that had once been unified through shared ceremony found themselves divided between traditionalists and those navigating colonial structures for survival. generational fractures emerged. Younger leaders grew up in a world where English expansion was constant and seemingly irreversible. Massasoit aged in this shifting landscape. He maintained the alliance carefully, even as colonial settlements pressed deeper into Wampanoag territory. Land sales, often negotiated under economic strain or political pressure, accelerated. English population growth dwarfed that of native communities still recovering from disease. By the time Massasoit died around 1661, the balance that had once favored cautious diplomacy no longer existed. He was succeeded first by his son, Wamsutta, known to the English as Alexander. Within a year, Wamsutta was dead, after being summoned and questioned by Plymouth authorities under suspicion of plotting resistance. His sudden death deepened mistrust, whether or not foul play had occurred. Leadership then passed to another son, Metacom. The English would call him King Philip. He inherited not his father's world, but a narrower one. By the 1670s, colonial livestock grazed freely across native planting fields. English courts claimed jurisdiction over native disputes. Firearms, once valuable trade items, were increasingly restricted from native purchase. Debt mounted, alcohol flowed. Land transactions, some coerced and others manipulated through translation gaps, stripped tribes of territory piece by piece. Yet outwardly, peace remained. Colonial leaders pointed to decades without major war in southern New England as evidence of stability. Trade still functioned, diplomacy still occurred. But beneath formal agreements, resentment fermented. To the English, expansion felt like divine destiny, proof of providential favor. To many native leaders, it felt like slow erasure. Rumors moved quietly through villages. Meetings took place in forest clearings beyond English oversight. The younger generation of Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett men had grown up watching their land diminish and their political autonomy weaken. Metacom observed all of it. He dressed at times in English fashion when diplomacy required it. He signed documents when forced. He maintained a surface compliance that reassured colonial authorities. But accommodation was becoming indistinguishable from surrender. Meanwhile, Plymouth Colony tightened its demands. Native leaders were required to surrender firearms. Oaths of loyalty to the English crown were imposed. Informants moved between communities. Trust thinned further. The peace that had begun as mutual necessity had transformed into asymmetry. One society was multiplying. The other was constricting. Fields that once symbolized cooperation now marked boundaries of dispossession. Rivers that once connected trade partners became lines of suspicion. The memory of shared harvests faded, replaced by calculation. And yet, no one declared war, not yet. By 1675, the region stood balanced on tension rather than harmony. A single incident, misinterpreted or intentional, could ignite what decades of pressure had prepared. Because peace, when built on unequal ground, does not break loudly. It fractures silently. And in that silence, something was already forming. Metacom understood that survival might require more than diplomacy. The English believed stability had been secured. Both were wrong. And as the fragile quiet stretched thin across New England's forests, the next chapter of this story was already taking shape. In whispered councils, in contested courts, and in the growing realization that coexistence was slipping beyond reach. Metacom had inherited more than leadership of the Wampanoag. he had inherited pressure. By the early 1670s, Plymouth Colony no longer treated native nations as diplomatic equals. The language of alliance had hardened into oversight. Colonial officials summoned sachems to court as if they were subjects. Disputes between native communities were increasingly judged by English magistrates. The balance that Massasoit once managed through careful negotiation had tilted decisively. Metacom understood the mathematics of population. English towns multiplied with relentless rhythm. Ships arrived each season with more settlers. Fences cut across former hunting grounds. Cattle grazed freely, destroying cornfields that native families depended upon. Complaints filed in colonial courts rarely favored native plaintiffs. Every year that passed made reversal less likely. The Wampanoag were not alone in their unease. The Nipmuc, whose villages lay inland, felt similar encroachment. The Narragansett to the west maintained uneasy neutrality, but watched events closely. Across southern New England, native leaders observed the same pattern. Land diminished through legal instruments few fully understood, backed by the quiet threat of militia force. The English saw deeds. Native leaders saw disappearance. Colonial authorities also began demanding symbolic submission. Firearms, once traded as tools of alliance, were restricted. Native men were ordered to surrender weapons in some districts. Loyalty oaths were required. The message was clear. Autonomy was conditional. Within Wampanoag communities, division deepened. Some chose adaptation. They entered praying towns, converting to Puritan Christianity under missionary guidance. These communities adopted English dress, English agricultural methods, English legal norms. Conversion promised a measure of protection, but it also fractured identity. Converts were often distrusted by traditionalists, yet still viewed with suspicion by colonists. Others rejected accommodation. Metacom moved carefully between these worlds. He maintained formal peace. He traveled to Boston when summoned. He negotiated when compelled. But he also strengthened regional communication with neighboring tribes. Meetings were held quietly. Alliances explored cautiously. The English began to notice. In 1671, Plymouth authorities confronted Metacom directly. They accused him of plotting an uprising. Surrounded by colonial pressure, he signed a new agreement, pledging loyalty, surrendering firearms, accepting further English oversight. On paper, peace was reaffirmed. In reality, humiliation had been formalized. Tension required only a spark. That spark came in the form of a man caught between worlds. John Sassaman had been a native convert to Christianity, educated in English institutions, literate in their language, and employed at times as an interpreter. He moved between Wampanoag and colonial communities with rare access. In early 1675, Sassaman warned Plymouth officials that Metacom was preparing for war. Whether this warning reflected confirmed plans, rumor, or personal positioning remains debated. But its impact was immediate. Soon after, Sassaman was found dead beneath the ice of Assawampset Pond. His death electrified the region. Plymouth authorities did something unprecedented. They asserted jurisdiction over the case and arrested 3 Wampanoag men, accusing them of Sassaman's murder. The trial that followed was conducted in an English court, under English legal procedure, before a mixed jury that included colonists and a handful of Christian natives. To the Wampanoag, the message was unmistakable. The English now claimed authority to try and execute members of sovereign native communities for crimes involving one of their own. The 3 accused men were convicted and hanged in June 1675. Executions carry symbolism beyond punishment. In this case, they signaled that Plymouth no longer saw Metacom's people as autonomous allies, but as subjects. Within weeks, violence erupted. On June 20th, 1675, armed Wampanoag men attacked the settlement of Swansea. Homes were burned. Colonists were killed. Panic rippled outward with astonishing speed. Militia mobilized from Plymouth, then from Massachusetts Bay. Riders carried news between towns. Church sermons shifted tone, from vigilance to alarm. Frontier families fled toward larger settlements, abandoning isolated farms. What began as a local eruption rapidly widened. The English interpreted the attack as unprovoked rebellion. Many native participants saw it as defensive resistance. Retaliatory raids followed. Colonial forces struck Wampanoag villages. Food stores were destroyed, crops cut down. Each action hardened resolve on both sides. And then, something the English had not anticipated occurred. The conflict did not remain contained. Nipmuc warriors joined the fighting, attacking settlements in central Massachusetts. Soon after, elements of the Narragansett, who had attempted neutrality, were drawn in, particularly after colonial forces targeted them under suspicion of harboring Wampanoag fighters. The war was no longer a localized dispute. It was becoming a regional conflagration. Communication lines frayed. Trust collapsed entirely. The forests that had once concealed diplomatic meetings now concealed war parties. Roads that connected trade became avenues of fear. Metacom moved constantly, seeking to coordinate resistance across distances that colonial authorities underestimated. His strategy relied on mobility, knowledge of terrain, and surprise. Native forces struck swiftly, often at dawn, disappearing into wooded landscapes before militia could respond effectively. The English possessed numbers and fortified towns. Native forces possessed speed and familiarity with the land. By late summer of 1675, entire English settlements lay abandoned. Brookfield burned, Lancaster attacked, Deerfield struck. Refugees crowded into coastal towns, overwhelming resources. The scale of destruction shocked colonial leadership. They had believed native resistance would fragment quickly under military pressure. Instead, it was expanding. And as autumn approached, both sides understood something irreversible. This was no longer about a single trial, no longer about one death beneath frozen water. It was about who would control New England's future. The fragile peace that had lasted half a century had not shattered in a single moment. It had been eroding for decades. Now, the erosion had become fire, and the fire was spreading. By the late summer of 1675, smoke rose from more than a single village. It marked a pattern. Raids struck like lightning across southern New England, swift, calculated, and vanishing before organized retaliation could land. After Swansea, the violence radiated outward. In July, Nipmuc warriors ambushed colonial troops near Brookfield. A small garrison of settlers barricaded themselves inside a fortified house while attackers set it ablaze. The structure barely held. Reinforcements arrived at the last possible moment. The message was unmistakable. The frontier was no longer secure. Militia companies mobilized from Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut. Drums beat in town squares. Farmers traded plows for muskets. Ministers preached that the conflict was a test of divine favor. Days of fasting and prayer were declared, as if spiritual discipline might steady military uncertainty. But prayer did not prevent towns from burning. Lancaster fell in February 1676, after months of tension, though skirmishes had begun earlier. Homes were torched. Survivors were taken captive and forced into the winter wilderness. Among them was Mary Rowlandson, whose later captivity narrative would shape colonial memory of the war for generations, casting native fighters as instruments of terror rather than as combatants defending homeland.
Fear became contagious. Frontier families abandoned isolated farms, retreating toward fortified settlements along the coast. Livestock wandered untended. Crops rotted in fields. Trade halted. Inland roads grew dangerous. Native forces relied on asymmetry. They did not attempt to hold territory in conventional European fashion. Instead, they targeted supply lines, isolated settlements, and weakly defended outposts. They attacked at dawn or under cover of night. Knowledge of terrain allowed them to disperse before militia columns could engage in sustained battle. Colonial troops struggled with this form of warfare. European military doctrine emphasized formation, visible engagement, decisive confrontation. But the forests of New England fractured visibility. Ambush replaced open-field clash. Gunfire erupted from tree lines. Communication faltered. By autumn, over a dozen towns had been attacked, and still the alliances widened. The Narragansett had attempted neutrality. Their sachem, Canon Chet, resisted committing fully to Metacom's coalition. Yet colonial suspicion mounted. English leaders believed the Narragansett were sheltering Wampanoag refugees and warriors. Whether motivated by intelligence or anxiety, the colonies chose preemption. In December 1675, colonial forces launched a massive winter assault against a fortified Narragansett stronghold deep within a frozen swamp in present-day Rhode Island. The battle that followed became known as the Great Swamp Fight. Over 1,000 colonial militia marched through snow and ice to reach the palisaded settlement. The assault was brutal and chaotic. Fire consumed shelters packed with women, children, and elders. Narragansett fighters resisted fiercely, but the English numbers prevailed. By nightfall, the fort was destroyed. Hundreds of Narragansett were dead, many from exposure after fleeing into the winter wilderness without shelter or food. The attack eliminated neutrality. Survivors joined Metacom's campaign in full force. Winter did not slow the war. It intensified desperation. Food supplies became strategic targets. Colonial troops burned corn stores wherever found. Native war parties retaliated in kind. Famine stalked both sides, though native communities, already strained by displacement, felt it most acutely. The war no longer resembled isolated rebellion. It had become a contest of endurance. In early 1676, coordinated native offensives struck towns across Massachusetts. Providence was burned. Warwick destroyed. Even settlements within sight of Boston felt the tremor of vulnerability. For a moment, it appeared the colonies might fracture entirely. But structural advantages slowly asserted themselves. The English colonies, though politically distinct, began coordinating military efforts more effectively. Supply lines from coastal ports remained intact. Ammunition production increased. Larger troop deployments became possible. Native alliances, by contrast, faced strain. Sustained warfare required food and stable refuge. Displacement scattered communities. Internal disagreements resurfaced under pressure. Some tribes reconsidered participation, others sought separate peace. Metacom continued moving between camps, attempting to preserve unity. His strategy relied on prolonging conflict until colonial exhaustion forced negotiation. Yet time was not neutral. English population density allowed replenishment. Native losses were harder to replace. By spring, the scale of devastation was staggering. 12 towns lay completely destroyed. Dozens more were partially burned. Thousands of colonists had fled their homes. But native villages had also been erased, sometimes without documentation, their destruction recorded only in absence. The land itself bore scars. Charred beams jutted from ash fields. Abandoned orchards withered. Fences collapsed. Rivers carried debris. Both sides understood something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a war of warning shots or limited retaliation. It was a war reshaping the human geography of New England. And as 1676 advanced, the question shifted from who could strike hardest to who could survive longest. Spring did not bring renewal, it brought escalation. By early 1676, nearly every English settlement in the interior of Massachusetts was either abandoned, fortified, or in ruins. Frontier lines had collapsed inward. Refugees crowded into coastal towns like Boston and Salem, carrying stories of sudden attacks, of torchlit skies, of neighbors killed or taken into the forest. The psychological impact was immense. For the first time since their arrival, English colonists in New England felt genuinely vulnerable to removal. Entire communities considered retreating to ships. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed native forces were preparing to march on Boston itself. They were not. But perception mattered as much as strategy. Native resistance, now including large numbers of Narragansett warriors following the Great Swamp destruction, intensified coordinated raids. Towns such as Medfield, Weymouth, and Groton were struck in succession. Sudbury saw one of the bloodiest engagements of the war when native fighters ambushed colonial militia sent to defend the settlement, killing a significant portion of the relief force. Colonial leadership recognized that reactive defense was insufficient. They began adapting. Instead of waiting for attacks, militia units launched deep-range patrols into interior territories, targeting native encampments directly. Scouts familiar with woodland tactics were recruited. Alliances with rival native groups, particularly the Mohegan and Pequot, provided crucial intelligence and manpower. The war was no longer English versus native in simple terms. It was a shifting web of alliances and rivalries, layered atop older intertribal tensions. War fractures old boundaries. Food became weaponized on both sides. Colonial troops systematically destroyed native planting fields. Corn stores were burned. Fishing grounds were disrupted. The objective was not merely to defeat fighters, but to collapse their logistical base. Without harvests, sustained resistance would falter. For native communities already displaced by winter campaigns, the strategy proved devastating. Families moved constantly, seeking refuge deeper inland, along river systems, into territories of uncertain safety. Children and elders bore the brunt of exhaustion. Starvation loomed. Disease followed displacement. Metacom's coalition remained formidable but strained. His strategy had always depended on unity and momentum. But as months passed, some allied groups began reconsidering the cost. The possibility of English victory no longer seemed remote, and English policy toward captured combatants added a new layer of fear. Prisoners were not merely detained, many were sold into slavery. Captured native men, women, and children were transported to the Caribbean, Barbados, Bermuda, or forced into servitude within colonial households. Exile removed them permanently from their homelands. It also signaled that surrender did not guarantee restoration. The war was becoming existential. In May 1676, native forces launched one of their boldest operations, the burning of Providence. Nearly every building in the settlement was destroyed. Only a handful remained standing. The attack demonstrated that even communities with established defenses could not assume safety. Yet the same month marked a turning point. Colonial forces achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Turner's Falls, attacking a native fishing camp along the Connecticut River at dawn. The assault killed large numbers, including non-combatants. The loss destabilized native supply lines at a critical moment in the agricultural cycle. Momentum began to shift. By early summer, hunger gripped many native groups. Ammunition supplies dwindled. Internal disagreements surfaced regarding strategy. Some leaders advocated dispersal and survival over continued coordinated assault. Metacom resisted fragmentation as long as possible. He moved through swamps and forests, evading patrols, maintaining symbolic leadership even as material conditions deteriorated. But his mobility increasingly resembled flight rather than command. Colonial coordination strengthened. Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut began operating with more unified military objectives. Intelligence networks improved. Rewards were offered for information leading to the capture or death of key resistance leaders. Trust eroded within native ranks. Some individuals, exhausted and starving, accepted English offers of clemency in exchange for allegiance or information. Others were captured and coerced into guiding colonial troops through terrain once considered secure. The forests that had sheltered resistance now harbored uncertainty. By mid-1676, the scale of devastation on both sides was staggering. Nearly half of New England's towns had been attacked. A significant percentage lay in ashes. Colonial casualties numbered in the hundreds, an enormous proportion relative to population. Native losses, though less precisely recorded, were likely far higher. But the war was narrowing. Where once flames had erupted across a wide arc of territory, conflict now concentrated around smaller, more desperate bands of fighters. Metacom's world was shrinking.
And the English, sensing advantage, began shifting from defense to pursuit. The conflict that had begun as regional uprising was entering its final, lethal phase. It would not end in negotiation. It would end in a hunt. By the summer of 1676, New England no longer resembled the frontier of hopeful settlements it had been only a year before. It looked like a war zone. Fields lay untended. Charred beams marked where homes had stood. Orchard trees, once symbols of permanence, bore fruit that no one came to harvest. Livestock wandered feral through abandoned clearings. Roads that had once connected neighbors became corridors of ash. The English colonies were not collapsing, but they were shaken to their foundation. Nearly 1 in 10 military-age men in some settlements had been killed. Economies froze. Trade with England faltered. Coastal merchants struggled to move goods inland through insecure territory. The cost of constant mobilization strained colonial treasuries. Church sermons shifted tone again. Early in the conflict, ministers had spoken of purification, of divine testing. Now they spoke of survival, of vigilance, of enemies within and without. The war hardened theology as much as it hardened borders. But if colonial society felt pressure, native communities faced devastation of another scale. Villages had been burned repeatedly, food stores destroyed before harvest, fishing grounds disrupted by patrols. Displacement fractured kinship networks that had defined identity for generations. Entire family lines disappeared through battle, starvation, enslavement, or exile. The English strategy of targeting sustenance was proving brutally effective. Without stable food supply, resistance became mobility without endurance. Bands of fighters moved constantly, carrying what little they could salvage. Women and children followed when possible. Elders often could not. Winter had been endured through resilience. Summer brought hunger. Colonial forces, meanwhile, refined their tactics. They relied increasingly on native allies, particularly the Mohegan under Uncas and remnants of the Pequot, who possessed deep knowledge of woodland warfare. These alliances were pragmatic, shaped by older rivalries that predated English arrival. For some tribes, aligning with the colonies was a calculation of survival against regional adversaries. War redraws loyalties. By June, Coordinated resistance was fragmenting. Some Nipmuc leaders surrendered. Certain Narragansett factions dispersed into smaller groups. Others fled northward toward French territories, seeking distance from English authority. The coalition that had once threatened the colonial core was dissolving under relentless pressure. Metacom remained at large. His presence alone sustained symbolic unity among those who continued fighting. But symbol could not replace food, nor could it shield from betrayal. The English recognized this. Rewards were publicly offered for his capture or death. Informants were cultivated. Captured warriors were interrogated. Psychological warfare intensified. The message circulated deliberately. Resistance was futile. Survival required submission. And submission came at a cost. Captured native men were often executed. Others were transported to Caribbean plantations, sold into slavery in markets far from the forests of their birth. Women and children were distributed among colonial households as servants or indentured laborers. Removal was as powerful as death. It erased continuity. Entire communities vanished from their homelands, not because every member had been killed, but because those who survived were scattered beyond return. By July, Metacom's forces had been reduced to smaller contingents, operating in the swamps and dense woods of present-day Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. The terrain offered concealment, but little nourishment. Colonial patrols pressed inward. They no longer feared overextension. The momentum had shifted decisively. Supply lines were secure, reinforcements plentiful. Intelligence improved daily. The war that had once threatened colonial extinction now appeared winnable. But victory would not restore what had been. English towns would rebuild, yes. Timber was abundant. Immigration from England would resume. Populations would grow again. For native nations, recovery was far less certain. Their demographic losses were catastrophic. Some historians would later estimate that a significant percentage of the native population of southern New England, perhaps up to 40%, died during or immediately after the conflict. War had not merely punished resistance, it had altered the demographic future of the region. By late July 1676, Metacom's circle had narrowed to trusted followers and family. Movement grew cautious, encounters rarer but more desperate. He had inherited a fragile inheritance. He had led a continental resistance. Now he was being tracked. The war's early flames had spread across New England like wildfire. Now they burned low, but intensely concentrated. And somewhere in the wetlands of Mount Hope, colonial scouts were closing in. The hunt had begun. The snow that fell that winter did not soften the land. It sealed it. By January of 1676, the war had ceased to resemble scattered uprisings. It had become a rolling firestorm, moving through the English frontier settlements of New England. The conflict, later known as King Philip's War, was no longer about a single trial, a single execution, or a single act of retaliation. It had transformed into a regional catastrophe. Across Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth Colony, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, isolated farms went dark. Smoke columns rose where barns had stood. Livestock wandered loose. Wells were fouled. Families crowded into fortified towns, their world shrinking behind timber palisades. And still, the attacks continued. Metacom, called Philip by the English, had forged alliances that few colonists believed possible. The Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, and other native communities coordinated strikes across vast stretches of forest and frozen marshland. They knew the terrain intimately. They struck supply lines, ambushed militias, and retreated before large forces could assemble. The English had built towns as if permanence were guaranteed. Roads connected settlements like veins. Trade networks tied farms to coastal ports. Churches anchored community life. War shattered those assumptions. In February 1676, Lancaster, Massachusetts was attacked at dawn. Houses were torched. Survivors were killed or taken captive. Among the captives was Mary Rowlandson, whose later published narrative would shape English memory of the war for generations. For the colonists, captivity stories became both trauma and propaganda, proof, in their view, of divine testing and native savagery. But on the other side, native leaders viewed the conflict not as savagery, but as survival. For decades, land transactions had chipped away at native territories. Debts were leveraged to force land sales. English livestock trampled cornfields. Colonial courts increasingly asserted jurisdiction over native disputes. Sovereignty, once mutual and negotiated, had become one-sided. By 1675, many native leaders believed that coexistence meant slow extinction. Winter did not pause the fighting. In December 1675, colonial forces launched a brutal assault on the Narragansett stronghold in what became known as the Great Swamp Fight. Hundreds of native men, women, and children were killed when English militia burned their fortified winter camp. The attack devastated the Narragansett people, but it did not end their resistance. Instead, it widened the war. Survivors joined Metacom's cause. The violence escalated. Through early 1676, native coalitions carried the war deep into English territory. Providence was burned. Warwick was attacked. Springfield, one of the largest settlements in western Massachusetts, went up in flames. By spring, more than a dozen towns had been destroyed and many more abandoned. Colonial governments struggled to respond. Militias were composed of farmers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers. Supplies were thin. Coordination between colonies was imperfect. Fear spread faster than orders. Yet the war was not evenly balanced. The English had advantages that grew more decisive with time. They possessed greater access to gunpowder and shot. They could draw reinforcements from neighboring colonies. They controlled the coastline and the flow of trade. Most critically, they found native allies. The Mohegan and the Pequot, long rivals of the Narragansett and other groups, aligned with the English. These native allies served as scouts and warriors. They understood forest warfare as intimately as Metacom's coalition did. The conflict thus became not simply English versus native, but native versus native as well. Alliances reshaped by survival calculations. By late spring of 1676, the momentum began to shift. Metacom's coalition had achieved devastating blows, but sustaining a prolonged war proved difficult. Food stores dwindled. Ammunition ran low. English forces increasingly adopted native-style tactics, smaller units, swift pursuit, reliance on indigenous scouts. In June, colonial troops tracked Metacom to the Connecticut River Valley. He escaped, but the circle tightened. Raids that once struck confidently now felt more desperate. Then came betrayal. One of Metacom's own men, a native informant allied with the English, revealed his location. In August 1676, near Mount Hope in present-day Rhode Island, colonial forces surrounded him. A native ally of the English fired the fatal shot. Metacom fell. His death marked a symbolic end, though violence lingered for months in northern regions. His body was mutilated. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for years. A warning, a trophy, a message. The war that began with grievances over sovereignty ended in annihilation. The consequences were staggering. An estimated 40% of native populations in southern New England were killed, displaced, or enslaved. Entire communities were shattered. Survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean or forced into servitude within English households. The English colonies suffered as well. More than a dozen towns lay in ruins. 1 in 10 Englishmen of military age had died. The economic damage was severe. But the demographic balance shifted decisively. Native resistance in southern New England was broken. Land, once contested, now opened rapidly to English expansion. Colonial authorities hardened their policies, enforcing greater segregation and tighter control over native communities. The fragile world of negotiation that had existed in the early 1600s was gone. In its place stood a new reality: English dominance secured not by treaty, but by fire. The memory of Metacom would survive in legend, often distorted by colonial narratives. To some English chroniclers, he became a villain. To others, a formidable enemy. To native descendants, he remained a symbol of resistance against erasure. King Philip's War reshaped New England more profoundly than any conflict before the American Revolution. It hardened racial boundaries. It accelerated territorial expansion. It embedded fear and suspicion into the colonial psyche. And it demonstrated a brutal truth about colonial America. When negotiation failed, the frontier burned. But the story does not end with ashes, because from those ashes emerged a new political and cultural landscape, one in which English colonies grew more confident, more unified in warfare, and more certain of their right to expand. A certainty that would echo through the centuries to come. In the years that followed the death of Metacom, the smoke cleared, but the silence that replaced it was not peace, it was absence. Across southern New England, entire native villages no longer existed. Fields once planted with corn, beans, and squash lay untended. Fishing grounds that had sustained communities for generations went quiet. Trade routes that had once connected tribes from the coast to the interior dissolved. The land remained, the people did not. In the immediate aftermath of King Philip's War, colonial authorities moved quickly to consolidate their victory. Surviving native communities were disarmed. Many were relocated into supervised settlements, sometimes referred to as praying towns, where Christian converts were monitored and restricted. Others were forced westward, absorbed into distant tribes, or sold into slavery. Hundreds were shipped to the Caribbean, to places like Barbados, where they disappeared into plantation systems built on coerced labor. Few ever returned. For the English, the war had been terrifying. Towns destroyed, families massacred, livelihoods erased. But the long-term outcome strengthened their position. Vast tracts of land, once fiercely defended, were suddenly available for settlement. Expansion accelerated. New towns were surveyed and chartered deeper into former native territories. Farms multiplied. Roads stretched farther inland. The frontier pushed west, with fewer organized native coalitions capable of resisting it. The balance of power in New England had shifted permanently. Before the war, native nations had been political equals, negotiating treaties, forming alliances, and maintaining military leverage. After 1676, that parity was gone. The English no longer viewed native groups as sovereign powers, but as subjects, obstacles, or remnants. The psychological transformation was as important as the territorial one. The war hardened colonial attitudes. Fear had turned into justification. Colonists increasingly interpreted expansion not as encroachment, but as destiny. Survival in a brutal war reinforced the belief that divine providence favored their cause. Ministers preached that the devastation had been a test of faith, and that victory was evidence of God's design. At the same time, the conflict exposed vulnerabilities within the colonies. Coordination between Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Rhode Island had been uneven. Supplies were strained. Communication faltered. Out of crisis emerged cooperation. Colonial leaders recognized that unified defense was essential. Intercolonial military collaboration improved. Fortifications became more common. Militia systems were reorganized and strengthened. The lessons learned in forest warfare, mobility, scouting, decentralized command, would echo decades later in other conflicts. But for native peoples, the aftermath brought fragmentation. The Wampanoag population was decimated. Leadership structures collapsed. Cultural continuity fractured under forced displacement and enslavement. The Narragansetts suffered catastrophic losses from the Great Swamp Assault and subsequent fighting. The Nipmuc were scattered. Some groups survived in diminished form. Others were absorbed into neighboring tribes or disappeared from colonial records altogether. Memory, however, persisted. Among native communities, the war was not remembered as reckless rebellion. It was remembered as resistance, a final attempt to preserve autonomy in the face of relentless pressure. For generations, English narratives dominated the written record. Captivity accounts circulated widely. Sermons framed the war as a battle between civilization and savagery. Metacom became King Philip, a title that both acknowledged and distorted his authority. The language shaped perception. Calling it King Philip's War centered the conflict on a single native leader, as though the war were his personal ambition rather than a broad, collective response to systemic encroachment. Yet the roots ran deeper than one man. Land hunger drove colonial expansion. Population growth intensified competition. Legal systems imposed foreign structures on indigenous societies. Cultural misunderstandings widened into mistrust. The war revealed that coexistence, once cautiously negotiated, had become untenable under English dominance. It also marked a turning point in the development of racial boundaries. Before 1675, interaction between English settlers and native peoples had been complex and fluid. Trade partnerships, missionary efforts, and even occasional intermarriage occurred. After the war, segregation hardened. Suspicion replaced exchange. Native identity became more rigidly defined in colonial law. Trust had burned with the towns. Economically, recovery took time. Farms had to be rebuilt, livestock replaced, trade routes restored. Some frontier settlements were never reoccupied. Others rose again with stronger defenses and harsher policies toward nearby native populations. By the 1680s, New England appeared outwardly stable. But beneath that stability lay a new understanding of power. The English colonies had survived a war that threatened their existence. They had coordinated across political boundaries. They had mobilized civilian militias into effective fighting forces. They had endured loss and emerged dominant. That experience would shape future generations. When later conflicts erupted, whether against French forces to the north or against imperial control from across the Atlantic, the memory of frontier warfare informed colonial strategy and identity. King Philip's War became a foundational trauma, one that helped forge a distinct New England consciousness. It was not yet American independence, but it was a step toward it. Because the war proved something critical. The colonies could fight, coordinate, and win without direct English military intervention. They had defended themselves. They had shaped their own destiny on the battlefield. Yet the cost of that destiny had been borne most heavily by the native peoples whose world had been irreversibly altered. The forests of New England still stand today. Rivers still run past the sites of burned villages. Town names echo indigenous origins, reminders of those who once lived there. But the demographic and political reality forged in 1676 endured. English settlement expanded with fewer organized obstacles. Native nations in southern New England never regained their former strength. The frontier, once contested ground, became a launching point for further colonization. And so, the war that began with a trial in Plymouth ended by redefining an entire region. Not just who controlled it, but who survived within it. As the 17th century moved toward its close, the landscape of New England no longer resembled the fragile frontier of the early 1600s. What had once been a contested borderland between native nations and English settlements had hardened into a colonial stronghold. The transformation had been written in blood. In the decades before King Philip's War, English settlements clung to the coastline and river valleys, aware that their survival depended on diplomacy as much as agriculture. After 1676, diplomacy gave way to dominance. The war had removed the most powerful native coalitions in southern New England. No alliance of similar strength would rise there again. Expansion no longer felt temporary. Families moved west, into lands that only a year earlier had been battlefields. Fields were cleared where fortified villages had stood. Colonial maps expanded. Property deeds multiplied. The rhythm of ploughing and planting resumed, but it unfolded across territory fundamentally altered by violence. In Plymouth, the head of Metacom remained displayed for years, a grim reminder to native survivors and a symbol of victory to English settlers. It was not simply punishment, it was theatre. It declared the end of resistance and the permanence of colonial authority. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lingered unease. The war had revealed how vulnerable the colonies truly were. At its height, more than half the towns in Massachusetts and Plymouth had been attacked. Supply chains collapsed. Communication faltered. Panic spread quickly through rumor and sermon alike. That fear never fully disappeared. Instead, it embedded itself into New England's political culture. Defensive readiness became a constant priority. Militias trained more regularly. Fortifications were strengthened. Suspicion of nearby native communities intensified, even when those communities had remained neutral or allied with the English. The memory of sudden attack, of smoke rising at dawn, shaped behavior for generations. Native communities that survived faced a different kind of struggle. Those who had converted to Christianity and lived in praying towns found themselves mistrusted by both sides. During the war, many had been confined to islands or interned under harsh conditions, suspected of sympathizing with Metacom's coalition. After the war, their lands were reduced further. Autonomy shrank. Traditional governance structures weakened under colonial oversight. The Wampanoag, once central players in regional diplomacy, became marginalized within their own homeland. The Narragansett were forced onto smaller tracts of land under colonial supervision. The Nipmuc scattered into distant regions, some joining tribes farther west. The social fabric that had bound southern New England's native nations together unraveled. And yet, cultural survival persisted quietly. Oral histories carried the memory of resistance. Kinship networks adapted. Traditions continued in altered form. Survival did not always look like sovereignty, but it endured. Meanwhile, the English colonies grew more self-assured. The war had been fought largely without direct military intervention from England. Local militias bore the brunt of the combat. Colonial leaders made strategic decisions independently. Funds were raised locally. Supplies gathered locally. Alliances negotiated locally. That autonomy mattered. It fostered a sense that New England could manage its own defense and political affairs. The experience did not immediately produce rebellion against the crown. Loyalty to England remained strong, but it planted a subtle precedent. The colonies had acted collectively in crisis. They had survived. As the 18th century approached, New England entered a new phase. Population growth accelerated. Commerce expanded. Ports like Boston thrived. The memory of burned towns faded into history books and sermons, but its influence lingered in policy and perception. Relations with native peoples elsewhere in North America would continue to be shaped by the lessons of 1675 and 1676. Colonists had learned that native alliances could be powerful and devastating. They had also learned that dividing native nations, securing some as allies against others, could determine victory. That strategy would repeat in future imperial wars between England and France. The frontier, once defined by negotiation, now operated under a harsher logic. Expand quickly, fortify aggressively, distrust deeply. King Philip's War did not end conflict in North America. It refined it. For native peoples, it marked the end of an era of relative regional power in southern New England. For English colonists, it marked the beginning of unchallenged territorial expansion in that region. For both, it was a trauma that reshaped identity. The forests eventually regrew over burned villages. New towns replaced old clearings. Generations passed who knew the war only through stories. But those stories carried weight. They explained why certain lands changed hands, why certain communities disappeared, why fear and suspicion hardened into law, why expansion felt justified to some and catastrophic to others. King Philip's War was not the largest conflict in American history. It was not fought with massive armies or recorded in grand imperial treaties. Yet, proportionally, it was one of the deadliest wars per capita in American history. And its consequences radiated outward, altering demographics, redrawing political boundaries, and reshaping the moral landscape of colonial America. When colonial America burned, it did not simply rebuild. It rebuilt differently. More unified in defense, more confident in expansion, less willing to compromise. And from that transformation emerged a New England that would carry the memory of fire into every conflict that followed. By the early 18th century, the war had slipped from living memory into inherited memory. Children born after 1676 grew up in towns rebuilt stronger than before. They heard stories of smoke on the horizon, of midnight alarms, of neighbors lost. But they did not see the villages that had once stood where their cattle now grazed. They did not witness the alliances that had once balanced English survival against native sovereignty. What they inherited instead was a version of events shaped by sermons, pamphlets, and political necessity. In colonial retellings, the conflict became a moral lesson. Ministers framed the violence as divine judgment, followed by divine deliverance. The destruction of native power was interpreted as providential design. The narrative comforted a society still haunted by fear. Survival had meaning. Victory had purpose. But beneath that religious framing lay practical consequences that would ripple outward for generations. Land ownership accelerated at a pace unimaginable before the war. Properties that had once bordered native territories now expanded into them. Boundaries were redrawn with little opposition. English legal systems formalized claims that would have been contested only a few years earlier. The geography of power had changed. Before the war, native nations in southern New England could influence diplomacy, trade, and military strategy. After it, English colonies dictated terms. Remaining native communities were increasingly confined to designated tracts, placed under colonial oversight, or drawn into missionary systems that sought cultural transformation. The old diplomatic world, where sachems and colonial governors negotiated as counterparts, had dissolved. This transformation did not occur in isolation. Beyond New England, imperial rivalry between England and France intensified. The northern frontier, stretching toward Canada, became a new zone of contest. In those conflicts, native alliances again proved decisive. But the memory of 1675 shaped colonial strategy. Secure allies early, isolate opponents, move decisively. The methods refined during King Philip's War would echo in later struggles across the continent. Yet the psychological dimension of the war endured even more deeply. For English settlers, it solidified an identity forged in crisis. They saw themselves as a people who had faced annihilation and prevailed. That shared memory fostered unity across colonies that had once competed or quarreled. Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Rhode Island had learned the necessity of cooperation under threat. The habit of intercolonial collaboration, born of desperation, became a precedent. Decades later, when broader imperial conflicts demanded coordinated colonial response, New England would draw upon that experience. The infrastructure of militias, regional councils, and shared defense had roots in the emergency measures of 1675 and 1676. The war had also reshaped racial boundaries in ways that hardened over time. Before the conflict, cultural exchange, trade, and religious conversion created spaces, however fragile, for coexistence. Afterward, suspicion replaced familiarity. Laws regulating native movement, land ownership, and political authority grew stricter. Identity became more rigidly categorized. The frontier was no longer a shared space. It was a dividing line. For native communities, survival required adaptation under constraint. Some rebuilt within smaller reservations. Others migrated north or west, joining distant kin. Cultural continuity persisted through language, ceremony, and oral tradition, even as political independence diminished. The memory of Metacom endured quietly in native histories, not merely as a fallen leader, but as a symbol of collective resistance against overwhelming expansion. In English memory, however, his image shifted. Over time, he became less a contemporary threat and more a historical figure. Sometimes portrayed as a tragic antagonist, sometimes as a ruthless aggressor. The complexity of his motives, defense of land, sovereignty, survival, was often simplified. History, written largely by the victors, smoothed its own rough edges. But the consequences could not be smoothed away. By the turn of the 18th century, southern New England had become overwhelmingly English in demographic and political control. The transformation was swift and irreversible. Within a single generation, a region once defined by indigenous power balances became firmly embedded within the English colonial world. And from that foundation, further expansion radiated outward, toward the Hudson Valley, toward the interior forests, toward lands still inhabited by native nations who would face similar pressures in decades to come. The pattern was set. Encroachment, tension, conflict, displacement, expansion. King Philip's War had not created that pattern, but it had demonstrated its trajectory with devastating clarity. It showed what happened when negotiation collapsed and population pressures collided with sovereignty. It revealed the cost of misunderstanding and mistrust hardened into policy. It exposed how fear could justify annihilation. And it proved that the future of colonial America would not be shaped solely by distant kings and parliaments. It would be shaped on the frontier, in forests, along rivers, in settlements carved from contested land. The ashes of 1676 did more than mark an ending. They marked the beginning of a colonial order built on decisive dominance. An order that would continue expanding, confronting new frontiers, and carrying with it the lessons learned when New England burned. As the 18th century unfolded, the physical scars of the war faded from the land, but its structural consequences deepened. Southern New England no longer functioned as a meeting ground of competing sovereignties. It operated as a consolidated colonial core. English legal systems expanded westward, without the same degree of negotiation that had once characterized frontier diplomacy. Settlement patterns became denser, more permanent, more confident. Where fortified native villages once stood, meeting houses rose. Where council fires once burned, town halls convened. The transformation was not merely territorial, it was ideological. The generation shaped by the aftermath of King Philip's War inherited a worldview forged in existential fear. They believed that vigilance ensured survival. They believed that weakness invited destruction. And they believed, increasingly, that expansion was both inevitable and justified. Those beliefs did not remain confined to New England. As colonial populations grew and migration pushed outward, the mindset traveled with them. The lessons learned in 1676 informed frontier behavior in New York, Pennsylvania, and beyond. Preemptive fortification, suspicion of native alliances, rapid mobilization of militias, these became embedded habits. The war had served as a brutal education. It also altered the relationship between colony and empire. When imperial officials in London looked at New England after 1676, they saw colonies that had demonstrated military competence and organizational resilience. But they also saw colonies that had acted independently in crisis. Funds had been raised locally, decisions made locally, alliances negotiated locally. That autonomy would later complicate imperial control. While loyalty to the English crown remained strong in the late 17th century, the precedent of self-defense and coordinated colonial governance lingered. The habit of acting without waiting for distant approval had been normalized under fire. At the same time, the demographic transformation of southern New England reshaped economic development. With native resistance shattered in the region, land speculation expanded. Agricultural production increased. Coastal trade networks flourished. Ports like Boston grew in wealth and influence. A more stable interior meant stronger economic ties to the Atlantic world. The war had cleared space, violently, for growth. But its human cost remained immeasurable. Native communities endured not only loss of life, but loss of political cohesion. Traditional leadership structures were weakened. Intertribal networks fragmented. Cultural practices persisted, yet often under surveillance or restriction. Some native groups adapted by integrating into colonial economies as laborers or guides. Others maintained distinct identities within shrinking territories. A few migrated north, aligning with French-allied tribes in Canada, continuing resistance within a different imperial framework. The story did not end with defeat. It transformed. Memory became resistance. In English narratives, the war increasingly appeared as a contained chapter, a dangerous rebellion overcome through courage and faith. In native histories, it remained a pivotal rupture, the moment when coexistence gave way to subjugation in southern New England. These dual memories coexisted uneasily on the same soil. Over time, monuments would commemorate colonial survival. Town histories would record heroic defenses. Sermons would recall providential deliverance. Yet the absence of once powerful native nations lingered quietly in place names, rivers, towns, and regions that preserved indigenous words, even as the people themselves were marginalized. The geography remembered what politics tried to forget. By the mid-18th century, New England had become one of the most stable and densely populated colonial regions in North America. Its towns were organized, its militias disciplined, its economy integrated into Atlantic trade. It had moved far beyond the vulnerability of 1675. But stability had been purchased through elimination of balance. The fragile equilibrium that once required negotiation between English settlers and native nations had been replaced by unilateral authority. That shift would echo in every future frontier encounter, not just in New England, but across the continent. King Philip's War thus stands not only as a regional conflict, but as a template. It demonstrated how demographic pressure could escalate into war, how alliances could determine survival, how total destruction of an opposing power could permanently reshape a region. And perhaps most importantly, it showed how fear could harden into doctrine. When later generations of colonists faced imperial taxation, distant governance, and political tension with Britain, they would draw upon a legacy of self-organization forged in crisis. The instinct to coordinate across colonies, first sharpened in wartime emergency, would resurface. The fire of 1676 had not only cleared land, it had forged identity. An identity rooted in survival against perceived annihilation. An identity accustomed to mobilization. An identity increasingly certain of its right to expand. And so, the war that once seemed like an apocalyptic rupture became a foundational moment in the shaping of colonial America. A moment when negotiation failed, when coexistence collapsed, when a region burned, and when, from the ashes, a new and more dominant order rose, carrying forward both the confidence of victory and the shadow of what had been lost. As the century turned and memory shifted from witness to inheritance, the meaning of the war continued to evolve. In taverns and meeting houses, in printed pamphlets and family stories, the conflict was retold with sharper edges or softened tones, depending on the audience. For some, it was proof of divine favor. For others, it was a warning about the fragility of civilization on contested land. For native descendants, it was a wound carried forward, not only as grief, but as identity. The land itself bore quiet testimony. Stone foundations buried beneath pasture grass marked former homesteads burned in 1676. Old-growth trees rose where villages once stood. Rivers flowed past sites of ambush and reprisal without acknowledging what had occurred along their banks. Yet place names endured, reminders of the peoples who had first named them. Even as English settlement expanded, Indigenous presence did not vanish. Small native communities persisted in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, maintaining kinship ties, practicing ceremony where possible, adapting to changing economic realities. They navigated colonial courts to defend what land remained. They negotiated survival within systems designed to diminish them. Their story became one of endurance rather than dominance. Meanwhile, New England society grew more structured, more layered. Trade wealth increased. Educational institutions formed. A regional culture took shape, disciplined, industrious, and vigilant. The war's shadow shaped that vigilance. Parents taught children to be alert to danger. Militia drills remained routine. Defensive architecture lingered in town planning long after immediate threats subsided. The expectation that crisis could erupt at any moment remained embedded in communal psychology. And yet, with each passing decade, the war felt further away. By the time imperial tensions escalated in the mid-1700s, new conflicts dominated attention. Struggles between Britain and France pulled New England once more into frontier warfare, this time as part of a global imperial contest. Native alliances again played decisive roles, though within a vastly altered balance of power. The template established in 1675, secure allies, strike swiftly, control territory, resurfaced. The descendants of those who had fought in King Philip's War now fought under British banners against French and Indigenous forces in the north. They carried inherited lessons into new battlegrounds. Coordination between colonies improved further. Military logistics matured. A regional identity hardened into something approaching unity. When historians look back, they often trace a line from these colonial wars to the eventual rupture with Britain. That line is not direct, but it is real. The habit of self-defense. The experience of intercolonial cooperation. The confidence born from surviving existential threat. All was strengthened during the firestorm of 1675 to 1676. Yet the deeper legacy lies elsewhere. King Philip's War marked one of the last moments in southern New England when native nations possessed the capacity to decisively challenge colonial expansion. After Metacom's death, no comparable regional coalition emerged there. The demographic imbalance became too great, the political landscape too fractured. From that point forward, English expansion proceeded with fewer coordinated obstacles in the region. The transformation was swift in historical terms, a single generation reshaping centuries of Indigenous presence. But history is not only measured in conquest, it is also measured in memory. In native communities today, the war remains a point of reflection, a reminder of resistance, sovereignty, and survival against overwhelming odds. In historical scholarship, It is examined not as a simple clash of cultures, but as a conflict born of land pressure, political miscalculation, economic competition, and mutual fear. The narrative has grown more complex with time. No longer framed solely as rebellion or savagery, the war is understood as a collision between two expanding worlds, one indigenous and rooted, the other colonial and rapidly multiplying. Both believed they were defending their future. Only one possessed the demographic and logistical power to sustain total war, and so the balance tipped. By the early 18th century, southern New England stood transformed, economically stronger, politically more unified, territorially expanded. But that strength rested on foundations laid through destruction. When colonial America burned, it did not burn evenly. Some communities rebuilt larger than before. Others vanished from the map. Some memories were inscribed in stone. Others survived only in whispered history. The war's end did not erase its consequences. It merely shifted them into the structure of the society that followed. A society more cohesive, more expansionist, more certain of its destiny, and less aware, perhaps, of the world that had existed before the smoke rose over New England's forests. Because wars are not only fought across landscapes, they are fought inside minds. To understand the full weight of King Philip's War, we must return briefly to the man at its center, not to retell battles, but to examine transformation. Metacom was not born into inevitable war. He inherited a fragile balance. His father, Massasoit, had navigated diplomacy with the English during their earliest, weakest years. That alliance had once preserved both peoples. It had been practical, cautious, strategic. Survival through cooperation. But by the time Metacom assumed leadership of the Wampanoag, that balance had eroded. English towns multiplied. Livestock consumed native fields. Colonial courts asserted authority over native disputes. Land deeds, often signed under pressure, debt, or misunderstanding, steadily transferred territory away from indigenous control. For Metacom, this was not abstract encroachment. It was visible contraction. Each generation saw less hunting ground, less autonomy, less leverage. The English did not perceive themselves as conquerors, at least not initially. They believed they were purchasing land legally, expanding lawfully, farming productively, building permanence. But permanence for one society meant displacement for another. Metacom's decision to resist did not arise in a single moment of fury. It emerged from cumulative compression, from watching sovereignty dissolve piece by piece. War, when it came, was not an explosion of impulse. It was an attempt to reverse inevitability. On the English side, leadership faced its own transformation. Colonial governors and magistrates had long balanced firmness with negotiation. But once violence spread in 1675, their tone hardened. Ministers framed the conflict in apocalyptic language. Public fasts were declared. Sermons described moral testing and divine purification. Civilian fear reshaped policy. When towns burned, nuance disappeared. Militia captains who had once farmed beside native neighbors now pursued them through frozen forests. Survival altered perception. Personal loss intensified resolve. Retaliation escalated without pause. This psychological shift mattered as much as battlefield tactics, because after 1676, reconciliation became nearly impossible. Trust, once fractured, calcified into doctrine. English civilians who survived raids carried trauma into daily life. Children who hid in fortified houses during attacks grew into adults who believed permanent vigilance was necessary. The memory of vulnerability did not fade. It institutionalized itself. Town planning changed. Defensive stockades became standard in frontier areas. Militia readiness became cultural expectation. Suspicion of native proximity became reflex. The war rewired social instincts, and it reshaped economics in quieter but equally profound ways. Reconstruction demanded coordination. Timber had to be cut, homes rebuilt, crops replanted, trade restored, credit extended. Communities pooled labor and resources to survive. Out of destruction emerged tighter economic interdependence. Insurance practices developed informally through shared rebuilding efforts. Regional supply networks strengthened. Town governments expanded administrative control to manage reconstruction and defense funding. The crisis forced bureaucratic growth. Militarily, lessons were absorbed quickly. Colonial forces adapted to irregular warfare. They relied more heavily on native allies skilled in forest tracking. They abandoned rigid European formations in favor of smaller, mobile units. They learned that survival in American terrain required flexibility, speed, and local knowledge. These tactical adaptations would later define colonial fighting styles in imperial wars. King Philip's War became a training ground, not only for soldiers, but for a society learning how to sustain prolonged violence on its own soil. Meanwhile, for native survivors, adaptation took a different form. Some communities recalibrated politically, maintaining identity within shrinking geographic limits. Others integrated strategically into colonial economies as intermediaries, translators, or laborers. Cultural practices continued in modified forms, often beyond colonial observation. Resistance shifted from open warfare to endurance. Memory became preservation. The war's demographic impact cannot be overstated. Southern New England's native population had once rivaled or exceeded that of English settlers in certain regions. After 1676, that balance was irreversibly broken. Population loss through death, enslavement, displacement, and migration ensured that no comparable regional coalition could rise again there. Demography became destiny. With that shift, colonial confidence grew. Not immediately in triumphalism, the memory of terror remained vivid, but in long-term assurance. The existential threat had been survived. The largest coordinated native resistance in the region had been defeated. Future expansion felt less uncertain. That psychological transformation would echo across generations. When colonial leaders later debated imperial taxation or parliamentary authority, they did so from a foundation built partly on wartime autonomy. They had mobilized, governed, and defended themselves before. The seeds of coordinated colonial identity were watered in crisis. Yet, for all its structural consequences, the war's deepest legacy remains moral. It forces confrontation with a central tension of early American history. Two societies, each rooted in survival, expanding into the same space. One expanding through demographic momentum and legal frameworks unfamiliar to the other. The other defending ancestral land through alliances and armed resistance. Neither fully comprehended the scale of the collision. But only one possessed the numbers, the maritime supply lines, and the imperial backing to sustain total regional dominance. The result was not coexistence. It was transformation through devastation. And that transformation did not end in 1676. It became the pattern. Expansion, justified by fear. security defined by dominance, memory shaped by survival. As we move toward the final arc of this documentary, we are no longer describing battles, we are tracing consequences. Because the war that once seemed like a regional catastrophe became something larger, a rehearsal for the future shape of America. And what remains is to examine how that rehearsal, forged in flame, influenced the nation that would eventually rise from these colonia. Then we bring it to its final movement, not with smoke and musket fire, but with reckoning. Because the true end of King Philip's War was not the death of Metacom. It was the birth of a new order. By the early 1700s, southern New England had become something unrecognizable to those who had walked its forests a century earlier. English towns dominated the coastline and stretched confidently inland. Farms replaced former native planting fields. Roads linked settlements that no longer feared coordinated regional resistance. The shift had happened in less than a lifetime. Before the war, coexistence, however strained, required negotiation. Native nations like the Wampanoag and Narragansett possessed leverage. They could influence trade, diplomacy, and military balance. English colonies expanded cautiously because they had to. After 1676, caution gave way to momentum. Land speculation increased. Settlement planning accelerated. The demographic tide no longer met organized regional opposition in southern New England. Colonial growth became assumption rather than gamble. And that assumption shaped American development. The war had taught several lasting lessons. That population growth, once secure, becomes power. That alliances determine survival in unfamiliar terrain. That fear can unify fragmented colonies. That total victory reshapes political geography permanently. These lessons did not remain confined to the 17th century. When New England colonists later confronted imperial authority during the 1760s and 1770s, they did so with inherited memory of collective mobilization. They had once coordinated militias across colonies. They had once funded war independently. They had once defended their settlements without waiting for distant rescue. The instinct for intercolonial unity, essential during the American Revolution, did not emerge suddenly. It had precedent. Yet the moral dimension of King Philip's War remains more complicated than its strategic legacy. For English colonists, survival validated expansion. For native survivors, survival meant adaptation within confinement. One society expanded into confidence, the other contracted into endurance. The war did not eliminate Indigenous presence in New England. It marginalized it. Native communities persisted, preserving identity through kinship, language, and memory, even as political autonomy diminished. Their survival challenges the narrative of disappearance. It reminds us that history does not end when dominance is declared. It continues in quieter forms. Over time, colonial retellings simplified the conflict into a story of civilization overcoming savagery. That framing justified expansion and obscured the deeper causes: land hunger, legal imbalance, cultural misunderstanding, and mounting demographic pressure. Modern scholarship has peeled back those simplifications. We now see the war as collision rather than crusade. Two expanding worlds, two systems of land use, two understandings of sovereignty. One demographic trajectory made compromise increasingly impossible, and so the forests burned. But what emerged from those ashes was not merely English survival. It was the foundation of a colonial society more unified, more militarily experienced, and more certain of its destiny. A society that would continue expanding westward, repeating patterns first crystallized in 1675. Encroachment, resistance, war, displacement, expansion. King Philip's War did not invent that cycle, but it revealed its structure with devastating clarity. It marked the end of native regional dominance in southern New England. It marked the beginning of unchallenged English expansion there. It marked the transformation of fragile settlements into a hardened colonial core. And it embedded into American development a paradox that still echoes. The nation that would later speak of liberty was shaped, in part, by a war of elimination. To tell this story honestly is not to assign simple villain or hero. It is to recognize consequence. To understand that early America was forged not only in ideals and charters, but in fire and fear. When colonial America burned, it learned how to survive. When it survived, it learned how to expand. And when it expanded, it carried forward both the confidence of victory and the shadow of what had been lost. King Philip's War was not the largest war in American history, but proportionally, it was among the deadliest. It reshaped a region in a single generation. It altered demographic destiny. It hardened identity. And in doing so, it helped define the trajectory of a continent. The smoke eventually cleared from New England's forests, but the structure built in its aftermath endured, in towns, in laws, in memory, and in the expanding arc of American history. That is where the story rests. Not in the gunshot that killed Metacom, not in the burned meeting houses, not in the treaties broken or the sermons preached, but in the transformation that followed. A transformation born in flame and carried forward into the making of America.